Drake London and Darnell Mooney are the Falcons' dynamic wide receiver duo that might set their record books on fire.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code on all lowercase Locked On NFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka the Iron that Sharpens the Iron, aka Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong in this illustrious podcast, and I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are continuing our positional reviews, looking back at the 2024 season, looking ahead to the 2025 offseason. At each position group on offense. We've talked quarterbacks, running backs. Now we're talking wide receivers and tight ends. Right? We're going to be talking about, is the Parker Hesse agenda thriving because of Charlie Woerner? Do the Falcons need to upgrade their number 3 wide receiver over Ray McCloud? But first, we got to talk about Drake and Darnell, the hit, all-black remake coming soon to Nickelodeon of Drake and Josh, hopefully with 100% less abuse this time around. But talking about Drake London and Darnell Mooney, the Falcons' dynamic wide receiver duo, let's talk about Drake London first. Drake delivered pretty much exactly what I projected him to be this year. I projected him to have 99 catches, 1,239 yards, and 8 touchdowns. He finished with 100 catches, 1,271 yards, and 9 touchdowns. So basically, the difference between my projection and reality was that one sluggo touchdown against Jack Jones against the Raiders. Like, that's really the difference. And so, I thought Drake played really well this year. He lived up to my expectations, had that breakout number 1 wide receiver year that we thought he would have. But you may have heard me on Locked On Sports Atlanta last week talking and grading Drake, and I gave him a B+. And you're going to sit here and say, Aaron, why did you give him B+? You're nitpicking. And yes, I am. I am nitpicking. But the main reason I didn't give him a higher grade is because I don't think Drake was really beating number 1 corners this past season to get most of that production. I think when you look at Drake's best games outside of the Eagles game where he was beating Darius Slay a couple of times, he was mostly feasting on the number 2, number 3, sometimes even number 4, number 5 corners. For example, like Marshawn Lattimore, he avoided him 3 times, right? Lattimore was hurt in that week 4 game against the Saints. Then got traded to Washington, so he wasn't there for the week 10 rematch. And then Lattimore was hurt in week 17. And it's not as if like, I need to see Drake London beat Marshawn Lattimore or anything like that. I've seen Drake London beat Marshawn Lattimore and whatnot. But you can only beat the guys that are in front of you. But the main reason I raise this point, because it's like, okay, Drake's not really beating number 1s this year. So who is he beating? And it's like, this is just further propaganda, guys. I'm always pushing an agenda here on this podcast. I'm not always pushing an agenda, but usually, sometimes I'm pushing an agenda. Let's say that. And that agenda with Drake London is he's better in the slot. It's been true every year he's been here. And I think it was true last year, right? I think the majority of his best work came in the slot, right? That we went into the year thinking, okay, he's going to be more the Puka Nacua guy. And I think he wound up being more Cooper Kupp-ish in terms of how he fits in this offense, right? 49% of Drake London's targets this past year came when he lined up in the slot. If you look at that in LA and Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, the last 2 years combined, it was about 26% for Puka Nacua and 65% for Cooper Kupp. So, to me, on that spectrum, he's a little closer to Cooper Kupp than he was to Puka Nacua. And then when you look at Drake's yards per route run, our favorite, PFF wide receiver metric, because that was the metric that told us that Julio Jones was the best wide receiver in the NFL for like 6 or 7 straight years, right? Drake on that metric on slot plays was the 6th most efficient slot receiver in the entire NFL last year. So I'm thinking the Falcons just lean into it, right? I don't need Drake to beat Marshawn Lattimore. I need him to beat that slot corner, right? And so, and then you couple that with like, one of the things that you don't really do as a slot receiver is you don't go deep that often, right? And the Falcons really didn't ask Drake London for most of the season, really until after the bye week, to go deep. And most of his deep targets, I think he had like 18, 20 plus yard targets this year. And like 7 of them came in 2 games against the Chargers and Panthers. And that's basically it. So, it'll be interesting to sort of see if the Falcons, do more of Drake down the field now that Michael Penix is at the helm. One would assume that he will get more of those opportunities with Penix under center than he did with Kirk Cousins. But I also think a lot of that was just kind of design. It felt like the offense loved Drake more in the slot than they loved him on the outside and doing the sort of typical outside receiver stuff. And so, I feel like every year Drake has been here, there has been mounting evidence that I've been pushing basically since we drafted him, that he's a better slot receiver than an outside receiver. And one day again, maybe it's 2025, maybe it's a year in the future, but one day I would love to see some coaching staff in Atlanta lean into that notion. But let's talk about Darnell, the other half of the dynamic duo. If I was grading Darnell Mooney, I would give him an A+ just because he blew away my expectations. I projected him to have 56 catches, 710 yards, and 3 touchdowns. He finished with 64, 992 yards, and 5 touchdowns. I did not have Darnell Mooney being tied for second alongside George Kittle and only behind Justin Jefferson as the most explosive player in the entire NFL this past year with 21 20-plus yard plays. When we talk about why this Falcons offense was explosive, the answer is Darnell Mooney. And that's really it. It's basically he was the reason why this team was explosive when they were explosive. And so for the first 2 months of the season, you guys know I was hesitant. I was like, no, I'm not really buying the Darnell Mooney hype or whatever. But it was finally around that Dallas game where I stopped being butthurt, and started giving him props. And it's funny because the Locked On Falcons insiders, some of them told me, after I stopped hating on Darnell Mooney, the Falcons offense went into a tank, and I should have started criticizing Darnell Mooney in order to get the Falcons offense resurrected again. And so I will make this vow to all of you everydayers right here on this illustrious podcast that if the Falcons offense struggles at any point in the 2025 season, I will begin slandering Darnell Mooney once again as a sacrifice. I will fall on that grenade so that this Falcons offense can get out of the slump if should that happen again. So all jokes aside, I went into the season thinking Darnell Mooney would be like a quality number 3, a low end number 2. And instead we got a legit number 1-ish wide receiver. And you have 2 number 1s in the receiver. You have that 1A and 1B wide receiver, right, in this offense. And sort of who is the true number 1? Who's the 1A, right, versus the 1B? And it kind of depends, right? If you're just looking at it on who's the guy that the team goes to in those critical situations, 3rd down, 4th down, red zone, that was consistently Drake London. But if you're judging it by who's the guy that defensive coordinators are gearing their game plans toward, I think that was Darnell Mooney, right? That you look back at, when Drake London wasn't beating those number 1 corners, that was more Darnell Mooney. Again, wasn't like that was frequent this year, but you saw him beating Trent McDuffie, you saw him beating Jamel Dean, Trevon Diggs this season much more, right? And we talked about this ahead of that Broncos game where he's like, okay, who's Patrick Surtain going to shadow? And basically I made the argument that if Vance Joseph is smart, he put Patrick Surtain on Darnell Mooney because you want to, for a defensive coordinator, you want to gear your game plan to work away from eliminating those explosive plays, and that's what you want with that's what the Falcons got with Darnell Mooney. So it's interesting. It's kind of ironic when you think about this wide receiver duo because you look at all the efforts the Falcons put into trying to build that sort of 1A, 1B wide receiver during the Julio Jones era, right? From 2011 to 2020, right? Where they drafted Julio Jones to pair him with Roddy White, and then they drafted Calvin Ridley to pair him with Julio Jones, hoping that they would get that same dynamic. And, due to circumstances, age, injuries, other factors and whatnot, that we only really got that type of year from those 2 guys, whether it was Roddy and Julio or Julio and Ridley, in like 2012, right? And then 2019. And it's just kind of ironic to me that like maybe we'll get more than 1 year of Drake and Darnell being this dynamic duo that we really haven't seen in Atlanta since like the run and shoot days, where it was like they had a top wide receiver duo every single year, but that's kind of byproduct of their offense. Whether it was Terrence Mathis, Andre Rison, Michael Haynes, Burt Emanuel, Eric Metcalf, Tony Martin, all those guys back in the 90s and whatnot. And so, I think Darnell and Drake will have an opportunity to carve out their legacy in the years to come. Now, you look ahead to the future, they only are guaranteed to be here together through this 2025 season. right? Due to Mooney's guaranteed money running out after this upcoming season. Drake being a free agent, although we fully expect that Drake will have his 5th-year option picked up this spring, right? And so therefore his contract will be through the 2026 season. But given we don't quite know we can't say with absolute confidence here in January whether or not this coaching staff is going to last beyond this upcoming season. You just never know what's going to happen. So hopefully this will be a sort of a duo that we will continue to build around with Michael Penix, and hopefully there are many more years like we saw this past year to come, and better years than what we saw this past year to come. So, it's just interesting that this is the duo. I wouldn't have bet on that given all the other options that the Falcons have had over the last 12, 13 years and whatnot. So that to me was just kind of ironic and funny to me. But the Falcons benefited greatly from a dynamic duo, but could they benefit even more from a tremendous trio? And we'll talk for once positively on this podcast about Falcons offensive coordinator Zach Robinson and his ability to maximize this wide receiver core. And we'll talk about what that means for Ray McCloud's role moving forward. So therapy is a game changer, guys. And I've been off and on in therapy the last couple of years, and I've talked about some of the things it's taught me, like positive coping skills, like you can only control what you can control. And it also, helps with accountability, right? And Talkspace is going to help you get into the therapy game. Talkspace is the leading virtual therapy provider. It's going to make getting help that you need easy, accessible, and affordable. It's easy because sign up is simple. You can match with a licensed therapist usually within 48 hours. It's accessible because you can schedule sessions from the comfort of your own home and even message your therapist between appointments. And it's affordable because Talkspace is going to be covered by many insurance plans. And for most, it's only going to be a $0 copay. So it's even more affordable because you'll get $80 off your first month when you go to Talkspace at Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL and enter promo code SPACE80. That's Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL, promo code SPACE80 to get $80 off your first month. That's Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL, promo code SPACE80. So let's say something positive for once about Zach Robinson on this podcast. Every one of the Falcons wide receivers outperform their expectations in some capacity. And I think a lot of that is owed to the offensive system that Zach Robinson constructed, right? We saw a career year for Drake London. We saw a career year for Darnell Mooney, even though he had more production in that 2021 season when he had over 1,000 yards receiving. There's no doubt about it that he played much better football in 2024 than he played in 2021. Ray McCloud had a career year. Basically, his production this past year in Atlanta matched his 3 previous years combined. And even though Kadero Hodge only caught 7 passes and several seasons where he's caught twice as many catches, I would argue that he probably had more highlight reel plays in those 7 catches than he did in the previous years. So it's very clear that wide receivers do thrive in this offense, and it's less clear whether other positions thrive in it. But, we're being positive, right? Running back, tight end or whatever, but we're going to stick with the positivity here for now. So, it makes you wonder, right? If wide receivers thrive in this offense, what would happen if the Falcons had even better wide receivers than they currently had, or if they add a little bit more juice to this position, right? And we know that the Falcons have limited resources this offseason, and the bulk of those limited resources will be invested on defense, right? They have limited cap space, limited draft picks and whatnot, and maybe they'll create more cap. They will create more cap space, but by the time we get to March, and maybe they'll have more draft picks than they currently have by the time we get to April. We'll see. But we know since the bye week, we've been talking about how the priority is going to be upgrading the defense this offseason. And it's very likely that they're going to run it back with mostly the same offense, right? Changing the bye week conversation. We're like, oh, Kyle and Kirk will probably be back, but there's a chance they might leave. And it looks like there's a extremely high chance that Kirk Cousins is gone in Atlanta, despite what Terry Fontenot may tell you. And it feels like there's a better than average chance that Kyle Pitts has played his last down in Atlanta. So basically minus those 2 guys. But other than that, they're going to basically run it back with the same weapons and talent and whatnot at the other positions. So I would argue, again, this is an argument. This is mostly hypothetical. This is for your consideration, more so than something that I'm sitting here advocating for. It just, it's Locked On Falcons. We're being thought-provoking. I would argue if you're going to make one single addition to this offense, just one, the thing that you probably would get the most mileage out of is a big time wide receiver addition, just because of what we talked about with how Zach Robinson has structured this offense, right? And despite how good Darnell Mooney and Drake London were in the second half of the season, we talked a lot more about teams' willingness to kind of man up those guys, and not to sit here and say that it worked to shut down those guys, but it proved probably a little bit more effective than you would ideally want, right? And one of the things that we're likely to see now that Michael Penix is taking over at the quarterback position is teams are going to be even more willing to man up these Falcons wide receivers as a way to force Michael Penix, given his inconsistent accuracy, force him to have to make more tight window throws, right? And typically in the league, in the NFL, young quarterbacks struggle against man coverage. I know historically, having charted the defense since 2019, pretty much anytime the Falcons face a first or second year quarterback, their solution to that problem is that we're going to play man coverage, right? And force that guy to make some big boy throws. And I think you saw a glimpse of this strategy against Washington, and it also happened to be the game where Michael Penix struggled the most. And so we know there's a copycat league, and other teams are going to be like, we're going to do that. So that is something to keep in mind. And so, one of the benefits of adding a third wide receiver, in addition to, thriving in a Zach Robinson-led offense, is, if you're dealing with man coverage, having another guy that can go out there and just, hey, go get open is very valuable, given that's how teams are likely to play the Falcons. So there's no offense to Ray-Ray McCloud, but he's not quite that guy. And given what Ray-Ray McCloud was asked to do this year, I think Ray-Ray McCloud went above and beyond. I want to make that clear. But my issue is more with what Ray-Ray McCloud was asked to do. And again, this goes back to my Zach Robinson issues. But, it just felt like too often it was a little too much for him. And I think what this team ideally is looking for in a third wide receiver is more than what Ray-Ray McCloud provided, right? And I think these issues came to a head specifically against the Chargers, where I think Ray-Ray's limitations as a blocker, particularly in short yardage, where they were asking him to be basically a fullback on some short yardage runs, to block Derwin James basically as a tight end, right? And then you saw, as the weeks went on, we saw in those final two games of the season, Kadero Hodge start eating into Ray-Ray McCloud snaps, didn't we? So it's kind of telling me that Ray-Ray is good enough, but the Falcons can do better at that position. So that begs the question, what are the Falcons looking to do if they do choose to upgrade that position this offseason, right? We have three wide receivers in this offense. We know that Zach Robinson, if he had, to pick his poison, he's going to run 98% of this offense out of 11 personnel, right? And so there's three wide receivers. So you have the X wide receiver in Darnell Mooney, you have the Z wide receiver currently in Drake London, and then you have the slot receiver, which is the F wide receiver, and that was Ray-Ray McCloud. And I think it would be easy to just sort of assume, well, they upgrade Ray-Ray McCloud, get a new slot receiver for that F position. But I would argue, as I've argued already today, that you already have a better F wide receiver already on your roster in Drake London. And Drake can do a lot of the blocking stuff that you asked for that position. And that's a key part of playing that F wide receiver position. It's why Cooper Kupp has been so valuable with the Rams over the years, playing that same role, because of how often they want to play three wide receiver sets in that 11 personnel, that oftentimes, much to the chagrin of Ray-Ray McCloud this year, but not to the chagrin quite as much as Cooper Kupp or Drake London, that you kind of need that guy to kind of function as a tight end at times, right? And asking a 5'9", 190-pound Ray-Ray McCloud to do that in comparison to, say, a 6'4", 215, 220-pound Drake London, again, I feel like the answer is pretty obvious there. But when we argue what the ideal scenario for this Falcons wide receiver core, I would argue that it's moving Drake to the F, right? And again, we're not full-time. He can spend like 50, 60% of his snaps in the slot, which is up from the 40% he spent this past year. Cooper Kupp spends over 60% of his snaps typically in the slot. And so move Drake to the F, and then go out there and get a Z that kind of bridges the skill sets between Drake and Darnell, right? Drake is that big physical wide receiver that is a little lacking when it comes to speed and quickness, right? Darnell Mooney is that quick, explosive, speedy wide receiver that's a little lacking when it comes to size and physicality. So finding a guy that checks all the boxes, right? Speed, quickness, size, and physicality. Again, you don't need to be A+ across the board, but just be a little bit better than what we currently have in some of those categories. Be quicker and faster than Drake, be bigger and more physical than Darnell Mooney. So, a 6 foot, 100 and 200 pound wide receiver that runs a 4.4. That feels right. And of course, you're sitting there saying, like, yeah, Aaron, any wide receiver that checks a lot of those boxes is probably going to be a very high pick. And you're absolutely right. Those guys don't grow on trees. Those guys are typically top 50 picks, possibly even first round picks. Sometimes you can find that guy later in the draft, but it's not usually the norm. And so you're sitting here going, Aaron, how dare you? You're describing the Falcons picking a wide receiver in the first round. You're suggesting the Falcons use one of their first 2 picks in the draft on a wide receiver. And I'm not saying that. This is hypothetical, guys. Right? Just think about it hypothetically. If the Falcons had a normal amount of cap space, if the Falcons had a normal amount of draft picks, we would probably be spending a lot more time and energy talking about using one of those premium draft picks on a wide receiver this offseason. So, it's a similar conversation that we had last offseason about taking Rome Odunze at 8. And even though we got Drake and Darnell as the new hit show, I would argue, just arguing, spitballing here, that if we threw a third wheel on that new show, right? If it's a TV show, we'd probably put some attractive young girl on that show, and let's ratchet up the romantic tension between Drake and Darnell. Let's get the shipping wars going, right? On the forums, on Tumblr, on social media, wherever you want to go. So I'm just sitting here saying, just adding a third option would probably help boost the ratings if you're following what I'm saying. So, we're just talking about things we're considering. I'm not saying that, I'm not pushing this agenda. I wasn't pushing. We got to trade Tyler Algier. We're going to talk about the offensive line later this week. I'm not going to be, we're going to consider not re-signing Drew Dalman. It's not saying that, hey, don't re-sign Drew Dalman. I'm just, again, we're being thought-provoking on this podcast. That's what it is. It's January. We can consider so many different things in January. So we'll see. So it's just something to think about. And so we'll move forward talking more about the tight end position as well as the other wide receivers on the roster and what their future looks like. So from the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel is going to make the NFL playoffs even more exciting because right now, new customers can bet $5. That's right. For the price of one footlong, you can get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. And right in that FanDuel, you can bet so many different ways, right? You can use, straight up bets, the spread, but we love the same game parlays, right? Who's going to score those touchdowns? Who's going to have, the over-unders on passing and receiving yards, right? You can bet even like what's going to happen on each team's opening drive, right? It's going to be a punt, a field goal, a touchdown, a turnover, whatever you want. Just head on over to FanDuel right now and join today, and you'll get started with $300 in bonus bets at FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So talking about the tight end position, we're not going to talk nearly as much about Kyle Pitts as you probably think we should, given the position. We talked quite a bit about, Kyle Pitts and trading him yesterday on the pod, so go check that out. But we're going to talk about the tight end that we know is going to definitely be here in Atlanta in 2025. That's Charlie Woerner, right? And Charlie Woerner single-handedly is holding up the Parker Hesse agenda, right? You remember that thing you heard me say a bunch last year? I was like, the Falcons run game isn't working quite this year because in order to have a good outside zone run scheme, you got to have good perimeter blocking. And you think it's a coincidence that the Falcons went out and got a good blocking tight end like Charlie Woerner, and you saw a big jump in the run game's production? Again, the Parker Hesse agenda is thriving, ladies and gentlemen. So, we'll see, whether or not that thing keeps going. Of course it will. So one of the questions, we look at this position tight end and it's like, okay, well, if Kyle Pitts, who knows if Kyle Pitts is going to be part of the plan? Certainly probably not part of the long-term plans as things stand. The question is just whether or not he's going to be part of the short-term plans, right? At this stage, right? And so, what are the Falcons looking for at this tight end position? And right, and again, how Kyle Pitts factors into that is a huge part of that conversation. But it's very clear that this team is not in love with Kyle Pitts, basically, and what he brings to the table. And I think the ideal tight end for what this team wants is someone that can block. And that's it. That's basically it, right? So as I said on previous episodes, they want a minivan. They have a Lambo. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with the minivan, especially when you got a minivan like Charlie Woerner. It's got TVs in the headrest, got some flames down the side and whatnot. It's, you're stunting in that minivan, carpooling the kids to soccer practice and whatnot. We love a soccer mom like Charlie Woerner, right? So, but I do think the ideal tight end in this offense is basically George Kittle, right? That's the ideal tight end. But obviously, George Kittle's George Kittle. The more realistic ideal that I think is achievable dream, rather than just assuming the Falcons are just going to draft the next George Kittle, a Hall of Famer, is someone more like Tucker Kraft, someone like Cole Kmet, Tyler Higbee from the Rams and whatnot. Basically a guy that is a good enough blocker to handle all the front side assignments that Charlie Woerner typically does. And Kyle Pitts is primarily a backside blocker. And for those of you not familiar, when I say front side and backside, front side is where the run play goes to, right? Or where the pass play goes to. So if you run to the right is the front side, the backside is the left side, right? And vice versa. So, they also like that tight end to kind of primarily chip and release, right? He's going to chip that edge rusher, help out Jake, help out Caleb McGarry. And certainly with Caleb McGarry protecting Michael Penix's blind side, you really want that guy chipping, right? And then just kind of settle underneath as a check down option, right? Rather than sort of be this dynamic, flexed out, split out wide, go out there and get open type of guy. But you want that guy to have enough juice as a pass catcher in terms of athleticism and speed that, when occasionally we need you to run that vertical seam down the field, you got it. So someone like basically with sub 4.7 speed. So that's really what I think the Falcons want in the position. And from what I hear, I haven't studied the draft class yet. We'll get there at some point. There's a lot of tight ends that may fit that description in this upcoming draft class. So we'll see if the Falcons go in that direction. So I think instead of, they have a Lambo and Kyle Pitts, they have a minivan in Charlie Woerner. I think they ideally want someone that, has a little bit more cargo capacity than the Lambo, but has a little bit more juice in the minivan. So that's like an SUV, something like that. So, we'll see if the Falcons go out there and add that SUV. But let's wrap up talking about the remaining receivers and tight ends on the roster. A couple of guys that are headed to free agency. Kadero Hodge. I think there's a very strong possibility that Kadero Hodge will get re-signed probably to a multi-year contract rather than the 1 year veteran minimum stuff coming off his Pro Bowl bid. That's something that's been a long time coming. If you've been listening to Locked On Falcons, we've been gassing up Kadero Hodge for years on this podcast. And so you can be mad at me for hating on Darnell Mooney, but, I was a day one of Hodge Hive. And, Darnell Mooney didn't make the Pro Bowl. So, again, I rest my case on who I should have been supporting this entire time. No, I'm kidding. But, Ross Dwelley, I'm basically no mas with Ross Dwelley. Like, to me, it would be a huge indictment of this regime if they can't find a better third tight end than Ross Dwelley this offseason. So we'll see on that front. Rondale Moore, another free agent. And I'm like, nah, we don't need Rondale Moore. I've seen people pushing this agenda that, Rondale Moore is supposed to be the number 3 wide receiver and we're going to re-sign him and this offense is going to cook even better. And I don't get that, because Rondale Moore was the 6th wide receiver on the depth chart at the time of his injury. Like we were talking about this during the summer, like he was on the roster bubble, right? Like, there was a chance he was going to get cut. And yet people are like, no, he's the real number 3. And like going back to what we were talking about earlier about what this team ideally wants in an F wide receiver. You want somebody who's going to bring, asking you ask a 5'9", 190-pound Ray-Ray McCloud, who's like 4 times the blocker that Rondale Moore is, to then say like, Rondale, do that stuff. I'm just like, all right, good luck, guys. So that's why, to me, anybody pushing to Rondale Moore is like, I don't think you understand what this offense is. And then I've also seen some Casey Washington, propaganda as of late and wanting to see him more involved. And I think a lot of this is because of the work that he did with, Michael Penix during the summer. And it's like, oh, like they have a really strong rapport. And for me, it's just like they, like you would have put anybody on the team and they probably would have worked well with Michael Penix, right? As the world's preeminent Penix pumper. Right, like get him good receivers, not just any receiver. Is basically what I'm at with the Moore and Washington stuff. So, Casey Washington was drafted to be a special teams player. Next year, he'll have an opportunity to compete across, to learn from Pro Bowl superstar Kadero Hodge as a special teams maven. He'll probably be in a 3-way competition for that opposite punt gunner spot across from Kadero Hodge with Micah Abernathy and Natron Brooks. And right now, I would say Natron Brooks is probably the front runner to win that spot. So we'll see about Casey Washington. But, basically all my hatred towards Darnell Mooney is now directed at Casey Washington. I don't understand the people that are pushing that stuff. But, fans are going to fan. They're going to do whatever they're going to do and get excited about, a number 6 wide receiver. It's like, it's not quite to the same degree because at least Casey Washington had more moments before people started saying out of pocket things. So I'll give Casey Washington that credit, but it's not quite as out of pocket as, the people that in June of 2021 were like, who needs Julio Jones when we have Frank Darby? And it's like, what are we doing here, guys? What are we doing here, guys? Oh man, wild stuff. So that is going to be it for our wide receiver tight end review, guys. Tomorrow's episode, we'll be joined by Jarvis Davis to talk about, revisiting the Jeff Ulbrich hire that we have basically been ignoring all week long because you guys don't want to hear me just absolutely eviscerate that decision. So we'll get Jarvis's thoughts on that, as well as the ongoing search for the D-line coach, I'm sure, as well as other topics. And then we'll get to the offensive line. So I think we're probably going to do a Saturday episode this week to talk more about the offensive line and go fully into that, because I do feel like that deserves an entire episode rather than just like 7 to 10 minutes to discuss. So look forward to that. And then next week, you'll see more myself and Jarvis Davis down in Mobile at the Senior Bowl, talking draft picks, talking tight ends, wide receivers. What? No, pass rushers. We're only talking pass rushers, but I will be, peeking at some of these pass catchers if today's episode has anything to do with it. So look forward to that, guys. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL as your second listen to get the scoop on this weekend's playoff action, as well as, what's going on with the coaching cycle. Jacksonville stuff's going on. People are hiring people, GMs, coaches, all that stuff and more. So Locked On NFL is going to have you covered. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.